Good morning. This is Brian Anderson again, bringing you another devotional thought. This time we are going to be in Genesis chapter 3. And what we find in Genesis chapter 3 is the first sin. We find Adam's sinful rebellion and the disastrous consequences that came into the world because of that first sin. Through the fall of mankind, as well as the introduction of this first sin, has come all of the suffering and misery and death, both physical and spiritual, that the world has ever seen. And in the story of chapter 3, we find that Eve eats the forbidden fruit first. Then she gives it to her husband, and he eats. And so we would naturally expect that God would hold her primarily responsible because she was the one that seems to be taking the lead in this first sin. However, that's not what God does. In chapter 3, verse 11, God calls to the man and he asks him, "Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" Interesting. Likewise, when we go to the New Testament in Romans 5, verse 12, we're told that through one man sin entered the world, not through one woman. So the question is, why is Adam held responsible if Eve was the one that took the lead in the sinful rebellion? Well, we have to remember that when God gave the command not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Eve was not present. Eve had not even been created yet. It comes up in Genesis 2, verse 16. So she wasn't there. Adam was. It was Adam's responsibility to communicate to his wife the word of God. We also find that Adam was created first, and then God created Eve to be a helper to him. And so that indicates that Adam was given headship in the relationship. And that's what we find when we go over to the New Testament. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, when Paul is giving the reasons why a woman should not have a position of an authoritative leader in the church, he gives some reasons. And he says in verse 13, "It was Adam who was first created, and then Eve. It was not Adam who was deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression." So here we find Adam wasn't deceived. He sinned with his eyes wide open. The woman was deceived. The man wasn't. So here's the principle. Those with more authority are given more responsibility before God. God told Adam that man must rule over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. The serpent was a creeping thing that creeps on the earth. But instead of Adam ruling over the serpent, he had allowed the serpent to rule over him. So I want to speak to the men, and myself being one of them, speaking to all of us. God has given us the authority and the responsibility to lead our families well. So the question comes to us, how are we doing in that regard? So men, are you praying for your wife and your children? Are you praying with your family? Are you initiating spiritual conversations with them? Are you protecting your children from the deadly effects that they may experience at school, if they're in a public school or even a Christian school? Are you protecting them from the deadly effects of given free access to go online or use their smartphone without supervision? Are you setting an example to your family of someone who takes responsibility for their actions and seeks God and seeks to do the will of God? So men, may God help us to take responsibility and to be godly leaders.